Chez Dillygence, chaque membre de l'équipe a un rôle crucial. Aujourd'hui, nous rencontrons Stanley Gershwin, directeur scientifique. Il nous raconte son histoire.
All right, let's start. Let's see what happens. Or have you already started? No.
I've already started.
I studied control theory in graduate school. I was more interested in applying what I knew, but in those days, it was mostly about aerospace. That was not my main interest. I worked for Bell Labs for a year. I did a little work in statistics of communication. I wanted to move back to Cambridge, which is where I went to school. And a friend of mine that I met in graduate school was interested in manufacturing and thought it ought to be something that really was studied in a professional way. And he was working at Draper Lab, which at the time was part of MIT. And I worked there for a while, and that was my first experience in seeing a factory from the inside. So I found some work by John Buzzacott, who was teaching in Waterloo University. I found a paper of his which studied transfer lines, particularly small ones, because he was looking for analytical solutions, and that was all he could find. So I liked it, and in fact I called him and we got to know one another. The fact that anything larger than a small line having two machines and one buffer, was the challenge to try to learn something. Extending his work to larger systems became a challenge for me, and I became obsessed with this. It took me several years to actually find a way of analyzing longer systems, and I developed the decomposition method for these lines. Rather, I wrote a paper about it for publication, but at the time I didn't know how to write a paper for publication, and it took me something like 5 or 6 years to finally get it published. And the first bit of attention that it got was from a guy who became a close friend, Yves Dallery, who developed a much better algorithm for solving the equations I developed than I did in my paper. And I immediately started using his algorithm rather than the one that I developed. And this work got a certain amount of attention. There were lots of extensions of the work. I started with a very simple model, which was probably unrealistic for most applications, but it was possible to develop a more sophisticated model. That was my main effort for a long time. So during that period, I had a terrific time with my visitors and friends and students. Some of them became lifelong friends since then. One of those visitors, who turned out to be a very important visitor, was Alain Pétron, who contacted me while he was in graduate school. A few years later, Alain visited MIT, spent a year there, I think, and we've stayed in touch ever since. One day, it was a big surprise to me. He said, "I'm forming a company, would you like to be part of it?" I said, "Of course." And that was it. Since I got involved with Dillygence, I learned a lot about manufacturing that I didn't know before. Really practical issues that I wish I did know earlier about how production lines operated and what the goals were, what the issues were, and so on. And I learned about some problems that I didn't realize before that could be attacked by the kind of mathematical approaches that I had taken before on other problems. What I hope will happen someday is that we'll work on some of those problems, and those problems will turn out to be useful and practical. And I hope that there will be more people with backgrounds similar to mine to continue that work. One of the benefits for me as a researcher in something in manufacturing systems was I started learning more things about factories than I knew before. I learned what some of the practical problems were, and I started thinking about those problems to see if there were to see interesting problems in that. I met many of the people that were part of Dillygence. I found them to be smart and motivated, and I had a lot of fun that way.
Vous souhaitez en savoir plus? N'hésitez pas à nous contacter.